I only learned my family divided the estate from a photo texted to me. My mother's dining table, 12 chairs filled, mine empty. The ache of exclusion didn't arrive like a stab. It settled like a slow, familiar weight in my ribs. The same weight I carried home from law school when people in this town smiled to my face and called me the one who left. As if ambition were a character flaw and distance a personal insult. And yet, even while that old ache spread, I kept my anger leash because I knew how quickly a woman's raised voice becomes the story, not the injustice that provoked it. I stared hard at the image until the screen dimmed, pinching wider to study the detail that hurt most. My empty chair, pushed tight to the table with its cushion squared, a tidiness that read less like forgetfulness and more like a decision. And in that tiny composition, I heard the headline they would never say out loud. We preferred the conversation without you. I zoomed farther and found the glint of crystal and the geometry of legal pads stacked like wafers of certainty. And at the head of the table sat a man I didn't recognize, mid-50s with the iron stillness of someone trained to outlast questions. Shoulders back, jaw set, one hand on a bulging folder and the other balanced on a cream envelope stamped with a small, stark C7. And although I couldn't hear his voice, I knew instantly he had already measured every person at that table and budgeted their doubt. My fingers, slick with sweat I refused to acknowledge, tightened around the folder I kept by habit in my messenger bag, the one where I collect receipts and notes and small proofs of who said what when. Because a reflex told me I would need evidence, not outrage, to step into a room that had already practiced life without me. The stakes entered my throat like heat when I pictured my father's hand, spotted and steady even at the end, pressing mine the week before he died, as he tried to say the word fairness and lost the breath halfway through. And I promised him I would stand inside the process and make it mean something beyond ceremony. A promise I understood now had been tested the second I wasn't invited to the first conversation in our house about everything he built and everything he wanted protected. I drove the 2 hours back on roads I could map blindfolded, the kind that cut between fields and past the aging billboard for the county fair, rehearsing the arguments I would make and the tone I would refuse to use, watching thunderheads bruise the horizon until a soft rain began that had the decency not to roar. By the time I pulled into our gravel drive, the porch light was off, but the dining room windows burned like theater. And when I stepped onto the front stoop and cupped my hand to the glass, I caught a fleeting reflection of myself. Hair damp, suit too big in the shoulders because I lost weight I hadn't meant to, locket dark against my collarbone where the chain always warms my skin, and in that reflection I remembered I was the overlooked middle daughter who went away to learn the rules, the one they said never came back right, yet here I was, spine lifted by duty more than belonging, thumb unconsciously tracing the seam of my folder until I felt the paper edge like a small blade. The kitchen clock ticked with the old house's patience as I slipped inside the back door, and with every step down the narrow hall I measured my breathing because anger makes sentences short and sharp, and I needed mine long, deliberate, undeniable. Laughter swelled, then thinned, and I paused at the threshold just long enough to let my eyes adjust from shadow to brass, letting the scene arrange itself around me. The blue-gray plates, the orchids in a low bowl, the lineup of pens like instruments, my mother's ring catching a light that made it look new, my brother Grant leaning back as if he'd already won something, my sister Paige folded into herself with the careful posture of a person trying not to tilt anything further. I looked first at the empty chair and felt that old ache answer like a bell. Then I let my gaze climb to the cream envelope because its presence rewired the room. The seal bore an embossed crest and a clean stamp, C7, and my chest tightened, not because I believed in talismans, but because I recognized my father's habit of precision in the way the corners aligned, and when I lifted my eyes, I found the unfamiliar man watching me with an expression that said both welcome and containment. He stood, smoothing his tie with a motion that earned him another second to assess me, and introduced himself as the Executor, a word that hung in the air like a gavel. Nobody had heard fall, his voice diplomatic, measured, practiced for rooms where other people's grief had to be processed into bullet points. My anger pulsed under control as I nodded, lips pressed to keep the questions in order, because suspicion was already whispering across the tablecloth. Who brought him here? Why the speed? Why the envelope tonight? and I slid my folder from my bag and placed it on the table with the quiet finality of a marker down in poker, my fingertips grazing the edge as if to say that I, too, had brought something that mattered. The executor's gaze fell to the locket at my throat, and for a beat he looked almost curious. Then something like calculation shuttered it, and I watched the micro-expression as if it were a flicker in footage, storing it away for later when analysis would be survival. Hope, faint and foolish, flickered when I caught Paige's eyes and saw apology flash there. A tiny lighthouse across the dark water of this table, and I decided not to embarrass her or myself by asking why I hadn't been called. Not yet, not here, because there are rooms where the first thing you say becomes a transcript, and if this was going to end in a courtroom hush one day, I wanted page 1 to show restraint, not rupture. I reached for the envelope almost without meaning to, so drawn by the seal that my pulse sank to it, and my mouth opened around a breath I didn't know I was holding as my eyes landed on the stamp. Clause 7, I exhaled, the words leaving me on a single stretch of breath that tasted like metal. The unfamiliar executor looks straight at me and, with a calm that feels rehearsed, slides the sealed envelope across the table without a word. "We proceeded without you," he said, smiling like that was the most reasonable sentence in the world. I felt the exclusion ache flare again, not as a shout, but as a press behind my breastbone, and I kept my anger under control because I could already sense how quickly this room would punish heat from me while rewarding cool from him. I glanced once at the empty chair that had announced my absence before I arrived, then straightened the folder under my palm until the edges aligned. The man at the head of the table watched that small act like it told him everything he needed to know. "Mr. Harrow," he offered, crisp, the consonants ironed flat. The precision matched the man, cufflinks placed like punctuation, tie knot identical to the one in the texted photo, and a pen resting near his right hand with a tiny red diode that pulsed every few seconds, the kind of pen that records the room whether the room consents or not. He moved as if time belonged to him. "Your father revised certain provisions," he continued, placing the cream envelope between us as though it were neutral ground. "Your presence was not required for preliminary steps, but I am happy to summarize." Grant leaned back, spreading into his chair with the practiced ease of a golden child, certain the narrative would break his way, while Paige sat forward just enough to look present, peacemaker to the bone, her eyes asking me without words not to detonate anything we could not control. Aunt Miriam hovered at the doorway, one hand on the frame, the unofficial gatekeeper who knows the traffic of a house better than any legal map. I kept my voice calm, almost gentle, because suspicion had started its quiet march across the tablecloth, and I needed it to travel farther. "I'll take the whole of it, not the summary," I said, adjusting my grip on the folder so he could see I understood what documents were and what they could do. Harrow's smile did not change, but the muscles near his eyes registered the pressure of a new variable. He tapped the envelope once with that recording pen, a gesture rehearsed enough to be part of his choreography. "There is a video will and an addendum codicil," he said. "Both in order, both consistent with your father's intentions as I understand them." "Then you won't mind playing the video and producing the addendum now," I replied, and I let the word now land with the weight of a deadline. I watched his eyes flick not to me, but to the seal, as if the envelope might speak in his defense. My own eyes went to the same place, eyes on the seal, and the embossing caught the light. The letters were clean and unmistakable. Clause 7. I heard my own breath leave me, a controlled exhale on Clause 7. The syllables thinner than I meant, and for a second I was simply a daughter seeing my father's habit in the neatness of the fold, the way he always squared corners as if truth could be kept from warping if you pressed hard enough. "Let's honor process," Harrow suggested, the words packaged as courtesy and aimed like a delay. "A quiet read tomorrow morning, when everyone is rested." Grant murmured agreement, the kind that tries to settle a room, while Paige's fingers worried a napkin into a rope. Aunt Miriam's gaze slid toward the mantel, and only then did I catch the absence that made my ribs tighten. The velvet watch box was there, but the watch itself was not, the small indentation in the fabric like a missing tooth. My father had promised that watch would be mine because I was the only one who cared where time went rather than what it could buy. Now, the groove in the velvet told me someone else had cared enough to take it. I let that breadcrumb sit between us and sharpened my tone just a fraction. A quiet read benefits whoever controlled the first draft of the conversation, I said. We'll read now. Harrow's smile fractioned, then reassembled as politeness. He pivoted to authority. As executor, I'm obligated to ensure order, he said, and the word order filled the room like a low hum. Order, Aunt Miriam repeated from the doorway. Not quite a question. I held the folder tighter, feeling the cardboard edge ground me, and I met his gaze. Order is transparency, I said. Play the video, open the addendum, let everyone hear what my father actually said. For a heartbeat, hope flickered. Paige's hand brushed mine under the table. A small pact formed without ink. Then the room went courtroom hush quiet, the kind that makes you aware of your own swallowing, the kind that teaches people to listen for the wrong thing. Harrow weighed the optics and the moment, the recording pen blinking like a metronome. He turned the envelope, showing the flap, and I recognized my father's handwriting immediately, an ache and a steadiness arriving together, to be opened only at the end. Clause 7. The words felt like a line he had drawn across a river, and I understood that any step past it would be noticed. Harrow nodded once, reaching for a letter opener that had appeared as if the table itself supplied it. Very well, he said, voice silken, and in the space before metal met paper, I felt the thunderclap relief of something finally being forced into daylight, followed almost instantly by dread at what light might show. The slice was clean, the seal surrendered, the flap lifted with a practiced thumb, and for a second he simply looked, performing that small pause men in control let themselves enjoy. He breaks the seal, unfolds clause 7, and as the page settles flat, my first name appears as the opening word. Alexandra inherits nothing unless she returns what was taken. The line read, and the room breathed in. The first sensation was not fury, but the old exclusion ache traveling up from my ribs into my throat, that private heat you learn to hide when your family decides the narrative before you ever enter the room. And I kept my anger under control because women who rise too fast are framed as storms, not witnesses. So I let the silence swell until it felt like a witness stand, then drew a breath steady enough to be on the record and said, without tremor, that I took nothing, not on any Sunday, not from any safe, not from a dying man who could barely lift his teacup without help. I glanced reflexively at the empty chair that had greeted me like a verdict, and tightened my grip on the folder as if paper could anchor me to the floorboards, while the executor's tidy voice tried to unmoor me from myself. Harrow folded the page with the same careful choreography he had used on the seal, and even in that economy of motion, I heard a kind of confidence that made me suspicious, the certainty of someone who expects accusation to corrode the accused before the facts ever arrive. The clause is simple, he said, eyes flat with professionalism, and read it again, emphasizing the vagueness as if vagueness were virtue. What was taken from the safe on the last Sunday? My eyes returned to the envelope's embossing, clause 7, and I felt my chest loosen around a controlled exhale on clause 7, not because I accepted its premise, but because the stamp reminded me of my father's taste for precision, and the imprecision here rang like a wrong note in his handwriting. Last Sunday, Grant repeated, finding a rhythm that suited him, the golden child warming to his role, suggesting with the lightest tilt of a shoulder that the timing made sense because I had visited alone that afternoon, and perhaps I had simply wanted more than my share, as if ambition had mutated into theft when grief blurred the edges of right and wrong. The room turned on that insinuation, chairs creaking, Aunt Miriam shifting in the doorway, Paige sitting up straighter with the peacemaker's instinct to dilute poison before it spreads. Say what you mean, I told Grant, still keeping my voice low, and I watched his eyes skate to the mantel where the velvet watchbox sat like a missing tooth in an otherwise straight smile. The flashback unspooled without my permission, because grief is a projector that doesn't ask for consent. Last Sunday's rain was the kind that slicks the whole sky into one sheet, the house dim even at noon, my father groggy from meds but stubbornly upright, telling me he wanted the window cracked so he could hear the storm, and when the power went once, then twice, I walked him back to bed, settee. The locket against the cool of my collarbone, and listened from the hallway to the old safe's familiar click in the study, a sound I'd grown up trusting because secrets in our house were supposed to be kept, not weaponized. Later, when the lamps hummed back to life, I noticed the brass pocket watch wasn't on its tray. I assumed Aunt Miriam had moved it for polishing, or that Dad had tucked it away before the outage, because absence in a sick room rarely means conspiracy at first glance. It means someone was tired. Now, at this table, absence meant accusation. "I didn't touch the safe," I said, the words even, the tempo deliberate, stating a fact as if I were laying a brick, and I watched Paige's eyes soften in that hope flicker way she has when she wants to believe me and is fighting the room to do it. "We can resolve this," I said, pivoting to process, because process is the only language rooms like this pretend to respect, by playing the video will and producing the addendum now. Harrow, still smiling the way professionals smile when they cite policy as shield, declined with a phrase that felt chosen for its ability to sound lawful while buying time. Chain of custody. He would not risk compromising the integrity of the files, not with the power flickers we had experienced, not with heightened emotions, not with me present, though he did not say that last part out loud. The room fell into a courtroom hush, that particular quiet where even the scrape of a fork matters, and I understood I had to change the terrain or be buried under it. "Then we'll reconstruct last Sunday minute by minute," I said, and I made the procedure sound inevitable, because inevitability is its own kind of authority. I would map my arrival to the storm's first knock on the windows, my father's tea to the first outage, the walk down the hall to the safe's click, the time I left to the moment the kitchen clock regained its stubborn tick, everything placed where it belonged until the vagueness had nowhere to hide. Grant scoffed, which is the sound a person makes when the scaffolding of their version creaks, but he didn't volunteer a timeline of his own, and that silence was instructive. Thunder rattled the panes as if on cue, and for an instant I felt a thunderclap relief at having something to do besides absorb insult, task as antidote to shame, followed by a steadier, almost solemn gratitude that the law, for all its flaws, still offers paths measured in minutes and not in moods. I turned the folder so the tabbed edges faced me, ready to begin the dull, holy work of listing, and the executor watched with a look I recognized from depositions, the one that says, "Let her tire herself, let her tie the knots we will later call rope." But before I could speak the first time stamp, a voice near my shoulder cut through the rain and the pretense in the pen's slow blink. Aunt Miriam, barely above a breath, said the safe soul. "Camera caught everything, and she has the memory card." The footage began with my father's voice. "If you're watching this, I failed to keep peace." The ache of exclusion hadn't left my ribs. It traveled with me down the back stairs and across the yard to Aunt Miriam's side door, where the tiny bell above the frame chimed the same way it did when I came home from law school, and stood there damp and uncertain, and I kept my anger under control because there was work to do. And in rooms like this, fury is noisy while proof is quiet. We sat in her sewing room among spools of thread arranged like a color wheel against the wall, the singer humming low as if it breathed with us, and Aunt Miriam slid a saucer toward me as if a cookie might brace a person for whatever lived on a thumbnail of silicone, then placed a little memory card beside my folder, my fingers automatically gripping the cardboard edge, the way a person grips a railing in a stairwell, with the lights out. She set a tablet on the ironing board, the screen small and stubborn, and when she pressed play, my father's voice filled the room with the gentleness he wore even when he was scolding us, and I exhaled the words that had become a liturgy since I saw that seal at the dining table, Clause 7, softly enough that only the locket at my throat could have heard. The image was grainy, a black and white view from the study's high corner where the crown molding hides decades of dust and at least one camera, the safe in frame like a square jaw set against the storm, a desk clock ticking without sound, and the first timestamp stamped itself into me, 8:12 p.m., the safe door easing open as if surprised to find itself obedient. At 8:14, the lights flickered beige to black to beige again, the whole picture shuddering just enough to make my stomach tilt, and I remembered how the house felt then, like it was resisting the weather out of pride. At 8:16, a hand in a glove, not latex, not winter, something in between with a matte finish that swallowed light, reached into view with the deliberation of someone who has practiced being unhurried, lifting a small velvet pouch from the lower shelf, the pouch slumping against the glove's palm with a weight that looked like a watch. At 8:17, the camera lurched an inch and held, as if the person had brushed the casing with a shoulder, and for a heartbeat, the corner of a sleeve crossed the bottom of the frame. A cufflink flashing in the minimal light, a tiny compass rose tilted north. Northeast, the kind of detail you could dismiss if you wanted life to be simpler than it is. I kept watching, refusing to blink as if blinking would erase what I did not want to know, cataloging the height of the torso and the span of the shoulder in the thin rectangle the lens allowed. It wasn't my size, not even close. Taller by at least half a head, broader through the chest, a silhouette that belonged to Grant more than to anyone else in the family, except that the cufflink did not belong to him because I had watched him unwrap every monogram set he ever loved, and not one looked like a compass. Harrow, though, the man who controlled every inch of his suit like it was a second skin, had worn plain silver circles to dinner, but the still photo from the text showed a different pair, and I felt suspicion shift inside me from a sharp point to a wider question. Who would borrow a language of direction if not a man who needed other people to believe he knew where he was going? Aunt Miriam paused the video and folded her hands in her lap, the thimble on her middle finger catching a sliver of light, her face a steady map of every Christmas and casserole that made this family tolerable. "Your father asked me to hold the card," she said, low so the house would not overhear, "and give it only if someone said Clause 7 out loud, because he wanted that person to know what it tastes like to speak a thing and receive the truth at the same time." I nodded, eyes on the freeze frame of that gloved hand, and felt for my locket in a motion that has comforted me since childhood, popping it open with my thumbnail until the hinge sighed, the paper scrap inside unfolding like a secret I'd never had to use. 4 digits, written in my father's tidy hand, not a date, not an address, numbers I had carried against my sternum for years without calling them to account. The hope flicker came then, not the naive kind, but the practical version that lives in a plan, because I saw the clause not as a judgment, but as a pressure device, a trap set for the person who thought a daughter's reputation was a fair price for a clean exit. And I understood that if we followed the numbers and matched them to the clocks and the outages and the yawning silences in Grant's alibi and Harrow's procedure, the room that had breathed in would finally have to breathe out. We replayed the segment twice more, and I measured the distance from the safe to the corner table, the angle at which the cufflink caught light, the way the gloved knuckles creased when the pouch shifted, all the small eyewitness chores that keep panic from making a fool of evidence. I said, in the courtroom hush that even a sewing room can hold when the stakes press into it, that tomorrow we would demand a formal video will in front of everyone, on camera if we could get it. No delays, no chain of custody excuse, and tonight we would make a copy of this footage in 3 places. One for me, one for Aunt Miriam's freezer like she does with birth certificates and spare keys, and one for the attorney who still answers my emails even when I write them after midnight. Thunder cracked in approval, a sudden percussion that rang like relief, and I felt a thunderclap release in my shoulders because I was not powerless. I was careful, and careful can be its own kind of force. I closed the locket and slid the memory card from the tablet with the steady hands I, save for deposits and cross-examinations, balanced it in my palm like a communion wafer, and reached for the little plastic case. The front window shattered with a scream of glass, air rushed cold across the sewing table, and when I looked down at my own open hand, the memory card was gone. I opened the empty watch box and found a groove in the velvet where something else had rested, a key, not a watch. The ache of exclusion rode back with me from Aunt Miriam's, a dull throb under my ribs that felt like the echo of shattered glass, and I kept my anger under control by counting my breaths in 4s, because the last thing I needed was to stumble into our dining room sounding like a siren. When I stepped through the archway, the first thing I did, stupid, automatic, was glance at the empty chair, the one that had been photographed to prove I was unnecessary, and that glance steadied me in the way only an insult can, because it reminded me exactly why I was here. My folder was still under my arm. I adjusted my grip until the cardboard bit my palm, then let my eyes land on the cream envelope again, eyes on the seal as if the paper were a compass, and I felt the smallest shiver of control return. Clause 7, I exhaled, barely a whisper, not because I trusted the words, but because saying them was like pressing a thumb against a bruise to measure the pain. The mantle looked wrong, the way a face looks wrong when a front tooth is gone. The watch box sat where it had always sat, but when I lifted it, it felt lighter. emptier than an empty thing should feel, and the velvet inside showed that shallow groove, not circular but narrow and straight, as if something slim had rested there precisely for years. Memory flashed, a childhood Sunday, me dusting the mantel while Dad quizzed us on state capitals, his voice warm as he said, "The flock returns to the lark," a phrase I'd filed with his shorthand and pocket rules. I ran a nail along the velvet's edge, and the tray shifted with a soft, secret click. The second compartment slid open like a polite apology, and inside lay a tiny brass key stamped with 4 letters that made my chest go tight. Lark. In the silence that followed, suspicion stretched its legs like a cat. Lark could be anything in this town. A storage unit nobody visits until taxes come due. A bank box guarded by a clerk with a talent for discretion. The old birdhouse brand Dad liked because it weathered well. But whatever it was, he had hidden its key where any thief obsessed with the watch would fail to look. I stood quite still with the key on my palm, letting the metal warm to my skin as the house hummed around me with the small noises of people waiting to see how the story would be told about them. Grant appeared first, wearing a jacket that could hide cufflinks and a smile that could hide almost anything. "Lose something?" he asked, eyes not on my face but on my hand, and I saw the calculation there. If he could make me defensive, he wouldn't have to answer a question. "Where were you last Sunday between 8 and 8:30? I asked, and because he is a man who practices plausible timelines like other people practice small talk, he gave me one involving a gym run, a protein shake, a call with a client who conveniently never answers after 9. "Cufflinks at the gym?" I said, and his mouth twitched just once before he shrugged as if the idea amused him. The jacket stayed on. Paige's voice drifted in from the kitchen. "Careful, the way you lower your tone when you're sliding a match past gas." "I invited Mr. Harrow," she said, and when I turned, she met my eyes like someone stepping across a creek on stones that might shift. "Ms. Patel's been in the hospital since Thursday. He called to offer help, said he'd worked with Dad's investor group years ago." She swallowed. I was scared, and he sounded like order. I heard the courtroom hush inside her sentence, the way fear can dress up as prudence, and I wanted to be cruel, but the anger that wanted that wasn't the kind that solved anything. "Order is transparency," I said, gentler than I felt, and transparency is time-stamped. The dining table still held its props, the stage not yet struck, and as I set the watch box down, a faint red diode pulsed near a napkin, a heartbeat where no living thing should be. Harrow's pen. I clicked the clip the way I'd watched him do it, and the device woke with a soft blip. A hiss of air, the scrape of a chair, and then voices layered over one another like threads on Aunt Miriam's rack. Grant's cadence quick, Harrow's steadying, Paige's fluttering at the edges. I scrubbed forward, and the word lark surfaced with the inevitability of truth rising from silt. "The lark box," a man said, Harrow by the precise weight of his consonants. "We'll keep it quiet, confirm after Sunday." In the background came the slide of paper across wood and a metal chime like a key set down too firmly, and my skin lifted in a wave of thunderclap relief, not because everything was solved, but because something finally pointed like a weather vane. I pressed my palm over the recorder, closed my eyes for half a second, and offered a small, solemn gratitude for the dumb luck of men who record themselves, because they believe recordings are always evidence for them, never against them. When I opened my eyes, I spread the napkins and silver as if I were laying out a map. "We find Lark tonight," I said, addressing the room but aiming the plan toward myself. "And tomorrow we ask for the video will in front of witnesses. No delays, no summaries, no missing pages." The key felt heavier once the sentence existed. Paige nodded, fragile but fierce. Grant's jaw tightened like a belt. I let the pen run while I checked the mantel again, fingerprints in the dust like commas in a bad story, then brought the device close to hear if anything else had survived the room's performance. A murmur bled through, low and intimate, as if 2 people had leaned in so the rest of the family could not overhear. My name. Then a breath shaped into a promise designed to sound like strategy, and not like the threat it was. On the pen's audio, someone whispers my name, followed by, "She'll trade the watch for the letter." The bank clerk slid a thin envelope across to me and said, "Your father left strict instructions. Present the locket." The ache of exclusion rode with me through the double doors and into the antiseptic quiet of the lobby, a hum of fluorescent lights and paper forms that made grief feel administrative, and I kept my anger under control by laying my folder on the counter, aligning its edge with the brass strip as if symmetry could substitute for mercy. I touched the locket at my throat, habit more than drama, and the clerk, a woman with the unflappable rhythm of someone who has seen families arrive as allies and leave as adversaries, nodded at the chain like it was a password. I said the word out loud to make it real. Lark. And watched her scroll through a ledger so old it still smelled faintly of ink, then disappear into the vault corridor with my father's initials on a claim slip and the tiny brass key sweating in my palm. When she returned with a narrow tin box embossed with a small bird mid-flight, I knew without testing that the key would fit. Still, I took a breath the way a diver learns to before breaking the surface, slid the key home, and listened to the pleasing stubborn tick of a lock, remembering how to open. Inside, a single sheet of my father's stationery had been folded with the precision of a man who ironed his ethics into his paper, and beneath it lay a second key tagged, in his careful block letters, C7. I did not read right away, because I wanted the moment to exist unobserved for a heartbeat. Then I lifted the letter and felt the paper soften where tears had warped it. His or mine, I couldn't say. He had dated it last Sunday, the ink crisp and unhesitating, and the first line carried his voice into me as cleanly as if he were seated across the desk with his hands folded, asking me to listen without interrupting. He wrote that pressure had begun to build from a person he had once trusted, and that he feared order would be weaponized to make expedience look like prudence, that he had hidden the pocket watch and placed a codicil clarifying Clause 7 where a daughter who understood clocks and codes would find them, and he told me the cufflinks to watch for bore a compass because men who prefer the illusion of direction often buy it in miniature. He asked me to tell the truth gently, even when it hurt, because he had practiced bluntness his whole life and suspected I had learned to sand it down to something survivable. I felt suspicion uncoil not as dread, but as purpose, the hope flicker I trust more than any promise, the one that turns a locked drawer into an invitation. The practical beat arrived on schedule. The C7 key was meant for a drawer in his study desk, the drawer I had tugged since childhood when I needed paper clips or the good scissors, and the codicil inside would restore his intent to the chaos of the addendum Harrow had flourished like a prop. I pressed the letter flat on the desk and read it twice more, tracing the familiar loop in his capital J and the small hitch in his S, letting the words settle into the places where doubt had built nests. The clerk hovered a polite distance away until I folded the page and slipped it into my folder. Then she leaned in the small human way people in institutions sometimes do when they cannot break rules but can offer context. A man had asked about this box earlier, she said, not with a key but with a voice that sounded like appointments and authority, polite enough to be disarming, persistent enough to be a storm. He had a square jaw and a tie that sat like it belonged to the shirt more than to him. Her description rang Harrow in my bones, and the thunderclap relief of confirmation hit me hard enough to make my knees feel briefly unreliable before gratitude steadied me, gratitude that he had been told no by a woman who knew how to say it. I stepped aside to the alcove by the safe deposit booths and called Paige, knowing better than to text something that could be screenshot to death. I told her to meet me at the house at dusk, that I had the letter and a key, that we would be reading a codicil in our father's study before any executor could declare the narrative closed, that I needed her to trust me not because I was older or louder, but because Dad had asked for truth, told gently, and she is the only person I know who can help me tell it that way. She said she would come, voice trembling into calm, and I could hear the kitchen clock in our mother's house thudding in the background like a witness remembering its oath. I thanked the clerk with the solemn gratitude owed to the keepers of small gates, slid the lark key into the interior pocket of my jacket, tucked the C7 tag where I could reach it without looking, and gathered my folder. The familiar grip now weighted with a letter that bent the future differently. The lobby doors hissed open on a gust that tasted like rain and street dust, and something metallic I refused to name, and for a second I had the childish wish to walk straight into safety, to skip the in-between where men like Harrow turn procedure into theater and daughters into exhibits. But there is no shortcut through a labyrinth you are born into. There is only the patient work of mapping. I pushed through the revolving door and out onto the sidewalk, already reaching for my keys, already imagining the drawer's lock yielding to the C7 tag and the relief of paper that matches intent, already practicing the cadence in which I would read the codicil aloud, so that even Grant would hear inevitability in the I syllables. And then the reflection in the bank's plate glass hardened into reality, and my stomach tightened in that old instructive way. As I step off the curb, Harrow is leaning on my car like it belongs to him, smile courteous, eyes cold, and he says, almost pleasantly, that he's glad I found a lark. The C7 key turned with a sound I recognized from childhood. Dad called it the sound of truth being stubborn. The ache of exclusion flared as I crossed the threshold into the house with Harrow's courteous smile still cooling on my skin, the sense that the front door opened for everyone but me, and I kept my anger under control by letting my fingers settle around my folder until the cardboard edge pressed a clean line in my palm. Passing the dining room, I couldn't help the empty chair glance. It sat square and prim like a closed mouth, and the sight steadied me the way a bruise steadies you when you remember why you refuse to flinch. The cream envelope remained where we'd left it, eyes on the seal out of reflex, and quietly, as if finishing an old prayer, I exhaled on clause 7, not for superstition, but because the word reminded me that process is the only blade I am allowed to carry into rooms like this. In my father's study, the light slanted low, highlighting dust motes that looked like a patient galaxy. The desk smelled faintly of lemon oil in winter. I slid open the center drawer, then, guided by muscle memory, pressed the false panel at the back until it yielded with a tiny sigh, revealing a narrow cavity hardly wider than a hand. The C7 key found its lock as if it had been rehearsing the reunion. When it turned, a second drawer eased forward, carrying 3 objects that rearranged my breathing. The true Clause 7 codicil folded to a perfect rectangle, a matte black USB drive the size of a thumbnail, and the pocket watch I'd grown up believing would one day keep my time honest. The watch was warm like a palm. The chain made a soft question in my hand. I opened the codicil first, because words are the spine that keeps every other proof upright. My father's handwriting steadied the room. The text was simple, stubborn, and precise. If the watch is missing, inheritance pauses. Whoever presents the watch with letter Lark inherits the stewardship role. The executor remains the family's choice, confirmed by counsel, not external. No flourish, no loophole, just a hinge. The watch and the letter together equal stewardship, and stewardship is care, not conquest. Suspicion slid into place like a well-cut joint. The fake clause that painted me as a thief had been designed to turn pause into exile, and choice into appointment. I set the codicil on the blotter and thumbed a USB awake on my laptop, the old machine wheezing as if it disapproved of haste. 2 files blinked against a black screen. The first, a ledger, scrolled columns of dates and amounts that left a metallic taste under my tongue. Unauthorized withdrawals stepping neatly through Sundays like footprints from the study to a shell account. The second file was a short clip pulled from the safe's camera, but this cut ended on a still tighter than the one in Aunt Miriam's sewing room, a cufflink frozen in focus, compass points engraved NE. The tiny arrow tilted, not quite north, almost east, pointing toward the man who believes direction is an accessory he can purchase. Behind me, the house breathed differently. Footsteps gathered, voices arranged themselves into order and opposition. Paige entered first, eyes wide, hope flicker alive in her face when she saw the watch and the neat fold of the codicil. I slipped a USB into my skirt pocket, then placed the letter in her hands because trust is a muscle that strengthens only when you use it. "Hold this," I said. "If anyone asks, you're reading it to Ms. Patel on speaker in 10 minutes. She nodded like a vow. Grant and Harrow followed, tension flaring as if carried on their sleeves. "Private study," Harrow said mildly, claiming neutrality while moving to the center of the room as though authority could be occupied like a chair. "Chain of custody," he added, eyeing the desk, the laptop, the unlocked drawer. "We'll need to secure these to avoid the truth wandering off?" I said, keeping my voice level. Courtroom hush wrapped around each syllable. I lifted the codicil so he could see the signature and the date. "Our father appointed the family to choose an executor, confirmed by our counsel. You aren't on any firm's roster, Mr. Harrow. You're a consultant my brother brought into a room I was kept out of." Grant bristled. Don't dramatize a favor, he said, tugging at a cuff as if it might settle his story. Harrow, precise, polite, countered with legal jargon arranged like fencing. Preliminary advisement, administrative necessity, implied consent. He said the words the way some men play scales, quick and smooth, hoping speed will exhume authority. Aunt Miriam stepped in without ceremony, a ledger of receipts and text messages already in her hand, like a librarian ready to shush a lie. She named dates, times, and weather, cited Dad's messages about confirming Ms. Patel, and reminded the room that a house may forget its groceries, but never forgets when a stranger walks in with the wrong kind of shoes. Ms. Patel is the confirming counsel, I said, and she will be on a call the minute we plug a charger into my phone. Harrow's gaze moved to the pocket watch. The room tipped very slightly. The watch is evidence of custody, he said, soft, and in that softness I heard the intention to reframe my father's heartbeat into an exhibit. Before anyone could answer, the world seemed to pull its own plug. The overhead light snapped off, the desk lamp stumbled into darkness, the air conditioner coughed once, and the house dropped into that cottony silence that makes you hear your own name inside your head. In the dark, bodies recalculated their distances. Paige's intake of breath scored the moment. I turned instinctively toward the doorway, watch cradled in my palm, chain looped over my fingers like a promise, and took one careful step so as not to jostle the codicil. A hand brushed mine, fast, practiced, and by the time the power stuttered back as a thin brown glow, the pocket watch was gone from my palm. We lit candles like it was a vigil, and I decided we'd hold our own reading, right then, right there. The exclusion ache followed me out of the study and into the dining room where the outage had left the chandelier a dead constellation. And as Paige struck a match, I kept my anger under control by arranging the candles in a line like a runway for the truth to land. The room looked like a stage set someone forgot to strike. Orchids wilting, pens aligned like silver needles, my folder under my hand like a pulse I could regulate if I gripped hard enough. I glanced at the empty chair because I couldn't not. It sat prim and mute, reminder and dare. The cream envelope, edges neat, waited where Harrow had placed it earlier. My eyes slipped to the seal, and I felt my breath leave in a quiet exhale on clause 7, the syllables tasting like a promise we would force to keep itself. "We're reading Dad's letter aloud," I said, voice steady enough to make the candle flames hold their shapes. "And I'm summarizing the codicil so nobody pretends they misunderstood." Paige took the letter with the care of a nurse lifting a rib cage, her eyes bright with the hope flicker I wanted to be worthy of. She began, and my father's handwriting entered the room through her mouth, the words about pressure from a trusted person, about hiding the watch and safeguarding stewardship, about compass cufflinks and the difference between authority and order. The faces around the table rearranged themselves under the candlelight's merciless honesty, Grant's jaw tightening like a rope pulled too fast, Aunt Miriam's chin tilted with the composure of someone who's kept a house through wars, and Harrow's smile unaltered, the professional's mask designed to outlast hurricanes. Grant exploded first, the way men do who are not used to being asked for daylight. "This is performance," he snapped, flicking his fingers toward the candles, as if flame were drama instead of illumination. "You're turning grief into a deposition." Paige's hand hovered in the air like a plea. "We'll get through this if we just follow process," I finished, before Harrow could cut her off with a velvet threat. He tried anyway. "If you insist on continuing, I'll call court officers to secure the premises and the documents. Chain of custody must be respected." He said it like a benediction. "Good," I said, and let the words sit. "But first, the room needs to hear itself." I reached into my pocket and set Harrow's pen on the table, its red diode blinking like a small, guilty heartbeat. I pressed play. The dining room filled with our earlier selves layered like gauze, chairs scraping, glasses chiming, and then the unmistakable duet of Grant and Harrow, their tones braided by strategy. "Keep her outside the room," Harrow's voice advised, precise and patient. "Clause 7 will handle her," Grant answered, the cadence of someone who believes a clause is a cudgel. Aunt Miriam's gaze didn't move. She has endured enough to know that sometimes the only dignity left is to witness. The courtroom hush that followed wasn't theatrical. It was the kind of silence that records. Breadcrumbs began to crystallize in the candlelight. "Compass cufflinks," I said, letting the phrase choose its target. Gifted by your firm last quarter, right? Grant's eyes flickered toward his jacket sleeve, a tell he couldn't command. Harrow's cufflinks tonight were plain, smooth, identical to the ones in the texted photo. He had been the voice, not the hand. And yet, in the flicker of flame, I caught a smear on Harrow's cuff near the buttonhole, a faint soot smudge, like the kind you collect brushing a mantle in the dark. Rough evening at the fireplace? I asked. He glanced down with the micro-startle of a man who prides himself on not missing lint. I drew the USB from my other pocket, the ledger's weight more moral than physical, and connected it. The laptop screen breathed to life off battery with a low, loyal glow. Numbers climbed in columns that do not lie. Transfers Sunday night, neatly stacked, amounts small enough to look like oversight until you walked them across a month and found a staircase. Money moved the night of the storm, I said, keeping the tone clinical because facts deserve clean air. That's motive for staging a theft, for using a vague clause to exile me so nobody asks why the pocket watch and the letter mattered together. Grant's chair squealed backward a half inch. You're inventing patterns to fit your resentment.
I'm reading lines you wrote, I answered, tapping the ledger, and listening to recordings you made. Paige reached for my free hand, and for a breath I felt the thunderclap relief of not carrying the whole weight alone.
Here's the deal, I said, drawing the sentence slow and legible. Tomorrow morning we hand everything, letter, codicil, ledger, footage, to Ms. Patel on camera. We sit in her office and let her tell us what holds in court and what belongs to shame. No more side meetings, no more consultants, no more rehearsed delays. Aunt Miriam nodded once, the kind of nod that seals a family statute. Harrow's smile remained courteous, but his eyes cut to the corners of the room the way a man checks exits. You are manufacturing spectacle, he murmured. I'm manufacturing daylight, I said, and left it there. As if summoned by the ayah word, the house's dark pressed closer, but the candles held steady. I reached to neaten the envelope out of habit and felt again the sting of what it had been used for, the way language can be bent into a weapon and passed off as etiquette. My fingers paused at the seam. Harrow had reopened it earlier under the pretense of propriety, and someone had bothered to smooth it closed again with a strip of transparent tape so neat it could almost pass for original. Something in the air changed, the tiniest draft from the hallway, a displacement you feel more than see. From the hallway, a faint ticking begins. My father's pocket watch, coming unmistakably from inside the cream envelope that Harrow reopened, and now sits sealed in the center of our candles. Ket watch was gone from my palm. Dad looked into the camera and said my name like an apology and a charge all at once. The candles guttered as if they understood what was about to cross the threshold between memory and instruction, and the old exclusion ache flared when I glanced at the empty chair that had made room for everyone but me. I kept my anger under control by gripping my folder until the edge imprinted my palm, and by fixing my eyes on the seal of the cream envelope, an old habit now, before I exhaled, quiet and even, on clause 7. Paige slid the laptop closer. Aunt Miriam turned the pen recorder face down as if to tell the room to hush. Harrow stood against the sideboard with a posture that said he would tolerate the performance and reclaim authority afterward. Grant folded his arms like a scaffold. I clicked play. My father filled the screen in the study's lamplight, thinner than I wanted to remember and still so absolutely himself that my chest hurt. Alexandra, he said, my name carrying both apology and instruction. Then he widened the circle. Children, Miriam, whoever else is watching, because it's your job to help, I love all of you. What comes next is not a test of love. It is a test of stewardship. He named the conditions with the same deliberate cadence he used to read bedtime stories. The lark, the watch, and the truth, 3 nouns that braided into a single obligation. The lark marks the place. The watch marks the time. The truth marks the person, he said. And though I felt tears wall at the rim of my eyes, I held them back because watching is work too. He leaned forward slightly, as if he could bridge the distance that video imposes on the living. Resist outsiders who promise easy order, he warned, the phrase shaped like a fence line. Order is simple when you erase the people who complicate it. Keep the people. He smiled then, the quick slant that used to precede a joke, but he didn't laugh. An executor must be confirmed by Ms. Patel. he continued, naming the woman who taught me the difference between a strong claim and a loud one, and by no one else least of all convenience. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Harrow's jaw notch almost imperceptibly. A man learning the script did not have a role for him. The video cut to a wider frame. Behind Dad, the study clock's face glowed. "One more thing," he added, and his tone shifted into the dry mischief that made me want to be clever for him as a child. "If the watch is missing, ask the person with the loudest certainty why they never wore their cufflinks on Sundays." Grant's mouth opened and shut like a man who had swallowed a stone. Paige squeezed my hand under the edge of the table, the hope flicker moving between our fingers like current. Aunt Miriam made a small sound that could have been a prayer. I paused the video, not for drama, but for record. "Look," I said, and pointed to the clock in the background. The hands pinned a time we had already built into our timeline. The outage window recorded on the safe footage. "That frame matches the storm's second flicker," I said, letting the courtroom hush do its work around the sentence. He filmed this aware of the intervals. He left breadcrumbs in the clocks. The candles held their flame as if they, too, understood that evidence loves neighbors. Harrow cleared his throat with professional patience, then began laying out legal gravel in front of himself. Chain of custody, preliminary advisement, the possibility that the video file's metadata might be corrupted by power fluctuations, each phrase smooth as a sales pitch. "We'll resolve all of that at Ms. Patel's office," I said, already moving us toward dawn, because strategy is a better use of grief than argument. "I'll call now and leave a message. We meet at 7. No more sidebars." We moved the family meeting to her conference table. Aunt Miriam nodded like a gavel. Grant said something about calendars, which is what a man says when he'd like time to think of a story that sounds like truth. Paige reached for her jacket and folded Dad's letter into its inner pocket, the way a chapel tucks away relics. I scrubbed the video forward long enough to let Dad finish saying what he had to say about scholarships and the tree he wanted planted by the creek, and how he hoped we would be kind when the money tried to make us unkind. When the file ended, the laptop returned us to our reflections. All of us ghosted on the dark glass for a beat before the candles found our faces again. I felt both thunderclap relief, because his words cut a path through the thicket, and a solemn gratitude that he had trusted us to walk it without him. "Dawn," I said, standing, letting the chair legs speak for me. "Miss Patel's." Grant muttered that this was theater. "Then bring your program," I answered, and closed the laptop. The house settled, a shift of wood and wind. Somewhere deeper inside, the faint ticking we had heard earlier went silent, a nerve ending releasing. I gathered the USB, feeling its small weight like a key against my skin, and slid it into the zippered pocket I never use unless I must not lose a thing. My phone buzzed against the table with a vibration that felt too loud for the quiet we had made. Unknown number. I thumbed it open because you only ignore a summons like that if you're willing to live with its shadow. The message appeared in a single line, clean as a cut, with none of the typos that betray haste and all of the calm that betrays planning. A text hits my phone from an unknown number. "Bring only the USB to the boathouse or the watch goes in the lake." The lake smelled like pennies, and the boathouse door was already open. The exclusion ache that began with an empty chair in a closed room rode shotgun the whole way down the gravel lane, steady and low, and I kept my anger under control by rehearsing the plan out loud to Paige in the dim interior of the car, the same way we used to practice spelling lists before school. I would carry the decoy USB where a thief expects to find it, in the easy pocket, while the real ledger slept cool against my skin inside the locket's chain, and she would stay put with the engine idling and her phone recording as backstop and witness. Because if there's anything grief has taught me, it's that a woman alone with a man who likes order needs a second pair of eyes to make the story stick. I checked my folder out of habit, even though I wasn't bringing it in, felt the familiar bite of the cardboard edge in my palm as if it could transfer courage, then touched the locket's hinge and exhaled once, quietly, on clause 7. Not because paper can save you in a boathouse, but because ritual steadies hands better than bravado. Inside, the air was colder than the night. The wooden ribs of the place lifted like an old whale pulled onto shore, and Harrow stood in the center where the slats meet, polite as a maitre d', holding my father's watch by its chain, so the ticking hung between us like a metronome for the lies that were about to be told. His smile was professional, a product more than a mood. Alexandra, he said, as if we were keeping an appointment and not answering a threat. You are capable, so I'll be plain. I'm fixing your brother's mistake. You can keep your portion, your sister can keep hers, the town can keep its little illusions, but the ledger needs to disappear so the estate can move cleanly. Chaos helps no one. His tone made chaos sound impolite instead of accurate. I stepped closer and let suspicion do the work of anger, because suspicion asks the right questions while anger asks to be seen. Who hired you? Why the envelope? Why write a clause that turns pause into exile? I said, taking my time so Paige's camera could gather all of it through the crackboard she'd wedged open with a tire iron. You wanted me to run so you could call my absence consent. He made a small show of looking offended by the suggestion of games. You imagine conspiracies because you're not practiced at the compromise, he said, lifting the watch a fraction so it caught the thin light that seeped through the gaps, and I saw in that tiny pendulum the thing he wanted to be, the keeper of time, the arbiter of sequence, the person who decides what gets remembered. Grant asked you in, I said, not as a question, and his eyes moved in the way men's eyes move when they're revising a story. He panicked when he realized the ledger stitched his Sunday to a shell account, I continued. And you brought paper and tone and the illusion of certainty to the table, and you counted on my absence to make the room easier to steer. He considered me for a slow beat, then offered a confession dressed as magnanimity. I drafted a paper clause 7 to put pressure where it belonged, he said, precise as ever. A tool, nothing more. You were meant to be uncomfortable, not destroyed. You were supposed to accept the new order and let stewardship pass to the person who could keep the ship straight. The watch ticked between us like punctuation. You can tell yourself you were fixing a mistake, I said, closing the distance by a foot so I could study the backplate, but you were laundering a motive. He kept the watch just out of reach, but when I leaned in I saw what I had come for. Micro scratches on the brass, the letters etched almost accidentally by years of key and chain, 4 in a row that reassembled into a word I knew in my bones. Lark, my father's small, stubborn breadcrumb, the one he hid in plain sight because he understood how greed mistakes the obvious for the unimportant. Hope flickered then, not the sentimental kind, but the tactical version that tastes like oxygen after a long tunnel, and I nodded toward the watch as if tipping my hat to my father's mischief. Ledger, Harrow said, extending his free hand the way a teacher extends a palm for a contraband phone. I pulled the decoy from my pocket with the inch-by-inch care of a woman who has learned to survive by making men believe they've won smaller versions of the thing they came for, and I let gravity deliver it to his fingers so the little plastic rectangle hit his palm with a sound that agreed with his understanding of the world. And the original? He asked. Because men who sell order cannot stop themselves from auditing even their own trophies. Stays with me until Ms. Patel says otherwise, I answered, and for the first time that evening he frowned, a small crack in the porcelain. You can't litigate your family in the court of public opinion, he said. The phrase so practiced it sounded like it had been waiting in his pocket for years, and I felt the courtroom hush rise up in me like a posture. No, I said softer. I'll litigate it in the room my father chose. He glanced toward the doorway where Paige's silhouette was a darker rectangle in the night, and for a flash of a second his mask slipped, calculation naked on the key. Bone. Time, I said, and nodded at the watch, is evidence too. The thunderclap relief of saying something true out loud in the place where someone hoped truth would feel rude jolted through me, followed by a quiet, solemn gratitude for the girl version of me who learned to check locks and memorize numbers and never let anyone tell her that being precise was unlovable. I lifted my hand, not to take the watch, but to count the beats between ticks, and in that suspended second the boathouse changed shape, as if the lake itself had leaned against the dock to listen. A splash shattered the hush. Grant burst through the doorway, shoes sliding on wet boards, arms pinwheeling for balance, and as he collided with Harrow, the real pocket watch tore free of the chain and arced toward the open lake. Miss Patel didn't look surprised when we walked in dripping wet, clutching a ticking pocket watch wrapped in my scarf. The dawn made everything look honest, even the puddle our shoes printed across her lobby tile. The exclusion ache that started at my mother's dining table throbbed faintly as I took the empty chair across from Ms. Patel's desk, and by reflex, glanced at it the way I glanced at that other empty chair. Then I kept my anger under control by placing my folder on the blotter and aligning the edge with the brass pen rest. Paige, pale and shivering in her hoodie, set her phone between us like a rescued animal. I felt the watch's weight in my scarf. It's ticking a small metronome for what we needed to do next. Quickly, Ms. Patel said, pushing a mug of tea toward me without looking away from my face. The same calm she used on judges who want fireworks and lawyers who confuse volume with proof. Tell me what happened and tell me what we have. I gave her the boathouse in a clean chronology. The text, the decoy USB in my pocket, the real ledger threaded into my locket chain, Harrow waiting with the watch swinging like a lure, his claim that he was fixing Grant's mistake so the estate could move cleanly, my stall to make room for Page's recording through the cracked board, his admission that he drafted a paper clause 7, the micro scratches spelling Lark on the backplate, and then the oiled chaos. Grant bursting in, Harrow lunging, the chain tearing, the watch flying. I told her I dove and felt the lake close over my head like a verdict trying to decide which way to go, that my fingers found the watch blindly enclosed, that Page captured the audio, that Harrow fled when his hands came up empty, and that Grant stood heaving on the dock like a boy who'd met the edge of his own story. Good, Ms. Patel said, and not because the night was good, but because the record would be. She wiped condensation from the scarf's wool and lifted the pocket watch in her dry surgeon's fingers. Your father's initials, original engraving, she murmured, tilting it so the face caught the office light. I slid the codicil across the desk, eyes on the seal as the red ribbon winked and exhaled on clause 7 the way a runner learns to breathe uphill. She verified the seal and the watermark and my father's hand without ceremony, then initialed a custody form with the briskness of a woman who has fixed worse. This codicil governs, she said. And Mr. Harrow has no standing. He is not counsel of record, not court appointed, and not confirmed by me. He will be removed. Paige tapped her phone awake. The boathouse recording opened into Ms. Patel's speakers, the creak of wet boards and Harrow's measured vowels filling the room. Grant's breath a ragged metronome beneath the words, "Keep it clean." Clause 7 will handle her, and ledger needs to disappear. Ms. Patel forwarded the file to the court clerk and the county bar with a short, unsentimental note. Now the ledger, she said. I gave her the USB from my locket chain and the decoy from my pocket, labeling each in my neatest print, and watched her copy them to an evidence drive while she narrated the chain of custody for her dictation app. When the spreadsheet bloomed on her monitor, its columns marched proof toward motive, unauthorized withdrawals stepping neatly through the storm nights, transfers that matched a shell account Page and I had traced to a P.O. box with Grant's firm listed on the rental application. The figure in the safe footage isn't Alexandra, Ms. Patel said, half to herself, eyes measuring height and shoulder from our still images. And the cufflink compass points with an NE tilt, that's not the set Harrow wore at dinner, but Grant's firm gifted compass sets last quarter, yes? Paige nodded, hurt flaring in her cheeks. It was a holiday thing, she said, voice small and steady. He made a joke about always knowing where the money was going. The joke fell between us with the weight of a confession disguised as charm. Aunt Miriam arrived in a raincoat that looked like it had repelled weather since the Carter administration, quiet fury radiating from the tidy knot of her scarf. She stood behind my chair like a standard. I felt my grief for Grant slide into a more difficult shape, love made complicated by harm, a tenderness that could not be allowed to argue with the ledger. Miss Patel printed the emergency petition to remove Harrow and appoint a temporary conservator. You, she said to me like an assignment due by lunch, stabilize assets until the hearing, freeze discretionary disbursements, notify the bank. We'll propose conditions for Grant to make restitution and for independent auditing. I nodded because the work felt like oxygen after a night of swallowing lake water. We also need a public statement, Ms. Patel said, or rumor will become the record. 2 paragraphs, no adjectives, will say the court is reviewing a codicil, that an unauthorized consultant was removed, that documents have been secured, and that stewardship, your father's word, will be honored. Paige reached for my hand. The hope flicker passing between us made me want to weep and work at the same time. I squeezed back. I'll read it, I said, gently, even when it hurts. Paper multiplied on the desk, petitions, acknowledgments, a notary stamp. The watch lay on a blue cloth, ticking like a small, stubborn heart. I signed where she pointed, my handwriting steadier than I felt, and thought of my father planting flags and problems one signature at a time. The thunderclap relief of being inside the room he chose, this office, this council, cracked through the fatigue, followed by a solemn gratitude that he had left us a map and not merely a warning. Miss Patel slid the codicil into a clear sleeve and dropped it in an evidence envelope with a sound that felt like a door locking in the right direction. We stood to leave, the three of us moving as one organism built this week out of fear, anger under control, and process. I lifted my folder, the grip familiar, and glanced once at the empty chair by the window because habits become rituals, and rituals make courage repeatable. The office door clicked, and the hallway smelled like paper and coffee and the first heat of the day. That was when the elevator chimed, and a courier stepped out in a gray jacket with a canvas bag against his hip, the kind of neutrality that makes him part of every story and none. He checked the label twice before speaking my name and held out a small, battered box. The postmark was yesterday -1, stamped from our town sorting center. The sender line was just my father's initials, written in his careful hand. As we reach for the doorknob, the courier sets the box in my hands. Addressed to me from my father, postmarked the day before he died. Inside the box was a second locket and a single line in Dad's handwriting. Stewardship is not a prize, it's a promise. For a breath I couldn't take, the office stilled around us, the copier muttering in the hall, the clock insistently civil, the smell of tea and manila mingling with damp wool from my scarf, and the exclusion ache that had started at my mother's dining table softened at the edges, not because anyone had apologized for the empty chair, but because the man whose chair mattered most had reached forward from the day before he died to pull me into the circle he intended. I kept my anger under control the way I have learned to do in rooms where fury becomes the headline and not the harm. I set my folder on Ms. Patel's desk, squared its spine to the blotter's brass edge, and touched the evidence envelope with the codicil inside, eyes on the seal as if it were a living thing, before letting out a long, careful exhale on Clause 7, a ritual that no longer felt like superstition but like a handshake with his design. The note was brief in the way a lighthouse is brief, one clean beam telling you what matters and what to ignore. He wrote that the language I had heard weaponized as punishment was meant as a safeguard, that pausing inheritance when the watch went missing was the only way to make sure no one could separate the timepiece from the letter that named the stewardship he wanted, that the lark was there to keep us honest about place, and the watch to keep us honest about time, and the truth to keep us honest about people. He didn't use the word trust because he didn't have to. The second locket lay in the box like a tiny mirror of the one I wore, a quiet redundancy that said he suspected storms and planned redundancies. By afternoon, I stood at the small podium in the courthouse annex, my notes clipped to a plain folder that felt heavier for being simple, and I delivered the public statement Ms. Patel drafted with me, firm on facts, gentle on family, all verbs, no adjectives. I said the court had reviewed a codicil clarifying Clause 7. I said an unauthorized consultant had been removed from involvement and that the family's longtime counsel, Ms. Patel, had been reinstated. I said records had been secured and would be audited. I said stewardship would be honored as design, not prize. I named no villains because the ledger would do that work without my help, and I blamed no weather because the storm had been only a stage, not a cause. The legal outcomes arrived as paperwork rather than drama, which is the shape justice prefers when it isn't being filmed for sport. An order removing Harrow from any role and noting his lack of standing. A stipulation appointing me temporary conservator to stabilize assets until the hearing. A restitution plan for Grant drafted in Ms. Patel's exacting hand, contingent on full repayment, independent auditing, and a formal apology to be entered into the record. A co-steward appointment for Paige at my request, because the house we need has more than one set of keys, and because my father understood that care is best practiced in pairs. Aunt Miriam signed acknowledgments with a pen that did not shake. Grant signed with knuckles white against the table. Harrow did not appear. What changed in me did not announce itself with trumpet or gavel. It settled more quietly, like weather that breaks and leaves air you can breathe. I felt the slow pivot from the daughter excluded to the steward responsible, and I chose boundaries that did not require bitterness to hold their shape. In the days that followed, I took the pocket watch to be serviced by a jeweler who remembered polishing it for my father when I was 9. I placed it on the mantel where the groove in the velvet could finally carry weight again. I slid a copy of Dad's letter into the new locket and kept the original in Ms. Patel's fireproof safe alongside the codicil. I archived the cream envelope in an evidence sleeve labeled in my neatest print, and for the first time since that photo of 12 chairs and one absence, the house fell to size for truth rather than performance. The justice payoff was not a single scene, but a series of small, durable ones. A transparency meeting filmed in Ms. Patel's conference room, where ledger columns, safe footage stills, and chain of custody forms were walked through with a patience that steadies people who fear they will be humiliated by math. A school board vote that protected my father's scholarship fund from being raided by temporary needs. A town council session where residents who had loved him for decades nodded at the word stewardship like it had always been theirs. Community trust did not surge, it steadied, which is a better miracle. When I spoke at the end of that meeting, I did not ask forgiveness for wanting the process to be as fair as a love we once believed we had. I asked a different question, one I hope finds the people who need it. If you've ever been kept outside a room where your name was spoken, what does forgiveness owe to duty, and what does duty owe to the truth you carry even when it costs you a seat? We gathered our papers in Ms. Patel's reception, that liminal space where rooms dissolve into hallways and outcomes become errands. I glanced one last time at the empty chair by the window, not because it still hurt, but because noticing it had become a way to remember the promise that filled its shape. And I gripped my folder the way a runner folds a ribbon into her fist, not as a trophy but as a reminder to finish strong. The evidence envelope caught my eye on the counter, seal unbroken and respectful, and I breathed soft and even on clause 7, then turned toward the door with Paige's arm linked through mine, and at Miriam's footsteps a measured echo behind us. A familiar pen rolled off the reception desk and landed against my shoe. When I picked it up, the tiny screen glowed with its last recording labeled Sunday 8:12 p.m. If you were left outside the room where your future was decided, what would you do? Fight, forgive, or both? Comment Clause 7 with your verdict and the one clue that convinced you. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the follow-up with the final rulings and who really sealed that envelope. Share this with someone who's had to earn their seat at the table, because your voice here decides what I open next.